Mexico, 1928. A year drenched in blood, ashes, and silence. The land was caught in the grip of war, though it was not a war between nations, but one between faith and state, between men who carried rifles and men who carried rosaries. In this fragile moment of history, when priests were hunted like criminals and entire villages whispered their prayers in secret, a peculiar story began to take shape. A story that still unsettles those who dare to look too closely. It is the tale of priests who, stripped of every sanctuary, stripped even of ink, chose instead to write their secrets in the ashes of the dead. Imagine the scene: a hidden chapel in the ruins of an abandoned hacienda. The flickering light of a single candle casting long shadows against crumbling adobe walls. A priest kneels at a makeshift altar, but his tools are not holy wine and consecrated bread. Instead, before him lies a sheet of rough parchment, a small clay bowl, and within it, a grey dust that was once a man's body. He dips a feather into the powder mixed with oil, and slowly begins to scrawl words across the page: prayers, curses, maybe even prophecies. These were not words meant to be read by the living. They were messages carried by the dead themselves, their ashes woven into the script. The chilling question is, why? The year 1928 was no ordinary year in Mexico. It was the height of the Cristero War, a brutal conflict sparked when the Mexican government, under President Plutarco Elias Calles, unleashed a violent crackdown on the Catholic Church. Churches were shuttered, public mass outlawed, and priests were forbidden to wear their clerical robes in public. The state wanted to sever the people from their faith, to erase centuries of devotion with the stroke of a pen. But faith does not die so easily. In towns and villages across the countryside, priests refused to vanish. They went underground, preaching in secret, baptizing children by moonlight, and delivering the Eucharist with the ever-present fear of soldiers storming through the door. Many were caught. Many were executed. Their bodies were left in the open as warnings, their flesh burned to dust. And in that dust, some saw not defeat, but a strange, terrible possibility. It was in this crucible of oppression that whispers began to spread of the ash manuscripts. Rumors that in remote corners of Jalisco and Michoacan, hidden among campesino huts or in caves carved into volcanic stone, priests had begun to keep records written in human ash. Some claimed these were prayers of defiance, asking God to remember his faithful even as governments tried to erase them. Others insisted they were codes, directions for rebels, passed down in a medium no soldier would dare touch. Still others believed they were darker, grimoires born of desperation, invoking not only God but something more ancient, something less merciful. What makes this story so haunting is not only the act itself, but the symbolism. Ash has always been tied to mortality, to repentance, to the reminder that all flesh returns to dust. Remember you are dust, and to dust you shall return, the priest says on Ash Wednesday, as he marks the foreheads of the faithful with the sign of the cross. But here, the ash was not symbolic. It was real. Human remains turned into sacred text. Each word carried within it fragments of bone, blood, and memory. These were not just prayers, they were relics, alive with the presence of the dead. And yet, we must pause to consider, were these priests visionaries, martyrs immortalizing their struggle in the only way left to them? Or were they heretics, desecrating the bodies of their brothers to create something that blurred the line between sacred devotion and occult ritual? Even the Catholic Church, centuries old and accustomed to relics and martyrdom, seemed to recoil from such stories. Official records rarely mention these manuscripts. Those that do are veiled in silence, tucked away in classified archives, labeled dangerous to the faith. The Mexican government, too, treated such rumors as subversive, evidence of fanatics who might inspire uprisings long after the war was over. Both sides had reasons to bury this chapter of history. But history has a way of refusing burial. In the oral traditions of small towns, in the whispers of campesino grandmothers, the story survived. Children were told never to play near certain caves, because the dead still speak in there. Some families swore they once saw priests gathering ashes from burned corpses, not for burial, but for writing. Even decades later, anthropologists collecting folktales in rural Mexico stumbled across fragments of the same legend. Manuscripts written in ash, carried by priests who fled execution. Tonight, we open the door to this forgotten chamber of history. We will step into the Cristero War, into the caves where ash became scripture, into the blurred lines between faith and fanaticism. We will ask what it meant for priests, men of God, to dip their pens not in ink, but in human remains. We will examine the possibility that these manuscripts truly existed, and if they did, what secrets they might still contain. Were they chronicles of suffering, or coded prophecies? Were they a desperate attempt to sanctify the dead, or a descent into a cult of martyrdom too macabre for the Church to acknowledge? The answers may not lie in history books, for history has tried to erase them. They may not lie in the archives, for archives have locked them away. But in the dust of Mexico's war-torn past, in the whispers that have never stopped, the story of the priests who wrote in human ash endures. And once you hear it, it is not easily forgotten. This is not just history. This is classified cult history, fragments of a war where faith became fire, where bodies became ash, and where ash became words. Words that might still be speaking, if only we dare to listen. To understand why a group of priests might turn to such disturbing practices, why they would take the remains of the dead and turn them into words, we must first step into the chaos of Mexico in the late 1920s. It was a nation on fire, both literally and spiritually. This was the era of the Cristero War, a conflict unlike any other, where the battlefield was not only fought with guns and bayonets but also with rosaries, hymns, and whispered prayers in the shadows. The roots of this conflict lay in the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920, which toppled dictatorships and promised a new modern state. But revolution always leaves scars. In its aftermath, the government began to look at the Catholic Church as a rival power, one that stood in the way of progress and reform. The Church was ancient, deeply embedded in the lives of ordinary Mexicans. For centuries, priests had baptized their children, blessed their crops, and buried their dead. To strip the Church from the heart of Mexico was to rip out its soul. Yet the government, under the leadership of President Plutarco Elias Calles, was determined to do just that. In 1926, the Calles Law was passed, a ruthless piece of legislation designed to break the influence of the Church. It placed strict limits on the number of priests allowed in each region. It forbade priests from wearing clerical garments outside the Church. It outlawed religious processions and pilgrimages. In some states, governors decreed that no more than one priest could serve an entire county of thousands. Church buildings were seized by the state, monasteries dissolved, and seminaries shut down. Suddenly, priests who had once been public shepherds of the faithful were driven into hiding, forced to celebrate Mass in barns, caves, and the back rooms of sympathetic families. The people did not take this quietly. Across rural Mexico, especially in the states of Jalisco, Michoacan, and Guanajuato, rebellion flared. They called themselves Cristeros, shouting their battle cry with every skirmish, "Viva Cristo Rey!" Long live Christ the King! Armed with rifles, machetes, and an unshakable belief that they were defending their faith, peasants and priests alike took up arms against federal soldiers. The war was brutal. Entire villages were massacred, suspected of harboring rebels. Priests were hanged from telegraph poles or shot in town squares as warnings. The government insisted it was stamping out fanaticism. The faithful saw it as martyrdom. It was in this desperate climate that religion became more than devotion. It became resistance. Every Mass held in secret was an act of defiance. Every rosary whispered at night was rebellion. And yet, for some priests, prayer alone was not enough. They sought ways to immortalize their struggle, to write down the faith that was being burned and outlawed before their eyes. But ink and paper were not always easy to find in a war zone. And so, in hushed rumors, we hear of them turning to something far more immediate, something that could not be confiscated as easily as books, the ashes of the fallen. This was not a war fought only with bullets, it was fought with symbols. The government painted itself as the voice of modern progress, stamping out what it called medieval superstition. The rebels saw themselves as warriors of Christ, defenders of centuries-old traditions. When soldiers burned bodies of executed Cristeros or priests, it was meant as an erasure, a final humiliation of their faith. But some of the surviving clergy refused to see ash as the end. They saw it as a beginning, a material that could carry words when all else was forbidden. Consider the landscape of the time. Remote villages where entire communities would gather in silence as a priest celebrated Mass on an overturned crate, the consecrated bread hidden in baskets of tortillas, wine disguised in clay jugs. Soldiers could storm in at any moment, dragging men out of their homes, executing them for harboring priests. Mothers hid their sons, not from crime, but from conscription. Children carried messages across hills, slipping past soldiers with scraps of paper tied into their clothes. Secrecy was survival. Within that climate, the idea of creating hidden manuscripts, texts written in a substance that no one would dare recognize, was not only plausible, but ingenious. The Cristero War claimed tens of thousands of lives. Official numbers suggest over 90,000 people perished in those 3 years, rebels, civilians, and government troops alike. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Fires were common. Corpses left in the streets were sometimes burned, reduced to anonymous piles of grey. 4 priests who survived these scenes, surrounded by ashes that once were flesh, the symbolic and the practical overlapped. To write with ash was to carry the dead forward into memory, to transform tragedy into testimony. Yet the story of the Cristero War is not just about faith and persecution. It is also about secrecy and silence. The Mexican government wanted to erase these rebels from history, branding them as criminals, bandits, and superstitious peasants. The Catholic Church, though sympathetic, was cautious. Rome eventually canonized some Cristero martyrs, elevating them as saints. But there were other stories, the darker stories, the unsettling practices, that the Church preferred to forget. The Ash manuscripts belong to this forbidden chapter, a narrative too macabre, too strange, to be absorbed into official sainthood. For the people living through those years, however, faith took on shapes both familiar and strange. It was a candle flickering in a dark cave. It was a whispered hymn drowned out by gunfire. And for some, it was words written in ash, a way to ensure that the fire consuming their bodies would not consume their faith. The Cristero War ended officially in 1929, when a fragile peace was brokered between the Church and the state. But peace did not bring closure. Instead, it brought silence. Archives were sealed, testimonies buried. Priests who had seen too much rarely spoke. And in that silence, legends took root. The legend of the Ash manuscripts is one such story, born of the flames of war, preserved in whispers, denied in official histories, but never fully extinguished. To step into 1928 Mexico is to step into a country fractured, bleeding, but also defiantly alive with hidden rituals. It is here, in this furnace of conflict, that the priests who wrote in ash first appeared. To understand their actions, we must not only trace the violence of the war but also the spiritual hunger it left behind. And it is in this hunger, this desperate need to preserve meaning against annihilation, that the strange practice of writing with human remains begins to make sense, if sense is even possible. The Cristero War was more than a clash of politics and religion. It was a war where the sacred was weaponized, where every act of devotion became an act of rebellion. And in its darkest corners, faith and death became indistinguishable, mingling together in smoke, in blood, and in words scrawled in ash. The Cristero War had created a fractured Mexico, but it also revealed fractures within the Catholic Church itself. For centuries, the Church in Mexico had been the unquestioned guardian of faith, but in times of fire and blood, unity began to crack. Beneath the surface of martyrdom and devotion, there were shadows, priests who strayed into forbidden territory, congregations that blended Catholicism with older, pre-Hispanic traditions, and whispers of practices that Rome would never sanction. To understand the story of the priests who wrote in ash, we must peer into these shadows. The official stance of the Church during the Cristero War was clear: defend the faith, but remain obedient to Rome. Priests were expected to offer sacraments, provide spiritual support, and if necessary, die as martyrs rather than compromise. Yet not every priest followed the same path. Some clung to orthodox devotion, clinging to the Latin Mass and the authority of the Pope even as soldiers hunted them down. Others, facing desperation and isolation, began to experiment, pulling from the surrounding indigenous traditions to give new form to their worship. In the chaos of war, lines blurred. Mexico had always been a land of spiritual fusion. Long before Spanish conquistadors arrived, the Aztecs, Maya, and countless indigenous groups had developed complex belief systems centered around cycles of death, sacrifice, and renewal. When Catholicism was imposed, these traditions did not simply vanish. They adapted, weaving themselves into the fabric of the new faith. The Virgin Mary became intertwined with Tenantzin, an ancient mother goddess. Day of the Dead blended Catholic All Souls' Day with pre-Hispanic ancestor veneration. In the villages, the Church's official teachings lived side by side with rituals that belonged to a much older world. During the violence of the 1920s, when the Church was forced underground, many priests leaned into this fusion more heavily than ever before. It was not always about heresy. Often it was survival. A Mass held in a remote mountain cave might open with Catholic prayers but end with chants borrowed from indigenous traditions, spoken in Nahuatl or Purépecha. The faithful, desperate for comfort, did not question these additions. In fact, they welcomed them, seeing them as a bridge between their suffering and the divine. But Rome would not have approved. To the Vatican, such practices looked less like adaptation and more like contamination, an infection of the sacred by the pagan. In these shadows, darker practices were whispered about. There were stories of priests who collected the blood of martyrs, not just to preserve it as relics, but to use it in rites that blurred the boundary between the holy and the profane. Others allegedly burned the bodies of executed Christeros, not only because they had no safe burial ground, but because the ashes themselves became sacred material, ashes to be preserved, carried, and even written with. If true, this was not merely devotion, it was reinvention, the creation of a hidden cult of martyrdom. The Vatican itself seemed to sense something unsettling in the air. Reports from papal envoys at the time reveal subtle warnings. Priests in Mexico, they wrote, must be careful not to let their zeal turn into superstition. Rome wanted martyrs, but not mystics who blurred orthodoxy. Yet the Church was too far away to control every cave, every village, every desperate priest who chose survival over strict doctrine. The Cristero War created conditions where authority fragmented. Each priest became, in some ways, his own bishop, his own guardian of the faith. And when that much freedom collides with that much suffering, strange practices inevitably emerge. Some historians suggest that the so-called Ash manuscripts may have originated not as deliberate occult acts, but as symbolic rituals. A priest, surrounded by the ashes of his fallen comrades, might have felt compelled to mix those ashes with oil and trace the sign of the cross on parchment, an act of remembrance and defiance. Over time, such acts could have expanded, evolving into longer writings, prayers, coded letters, or even entire psalms written in ash. But once such practices took root, it became difficult to distinguish between memory and magic, between honoring the dead and summoning their presence. The shadows of the Church were not limited to ritual. There were also political divisions. Some priests urged resistance, telling their flocks that to fight and die for Christ was the highest calling. Others preached caution, warning that rebellion would only bring more suffering. Still others secretly collaborated with local authorities, trading silence for survival. To the faithful, it was often impossible to tell which priest was saintly, which was compromised, and which was something else entirely, something far darker. This uncertainty fueled the legend of the Ash writings. It was said that the manuscripts were not held by every priest, but only by certain secretive ones, men who had crossed into the forbidden. In some villages, these priests were revered as prophets, capable of channeling the voices of martyrs. In others, they were feared, spoken of as sorcerers hiding under the guise of holy men. The line between priest and cult leader, between saint and heretic, became perilously thin. And here lies the most haunting part of this shadowed history. The Catholic Church itself, after the war, seemed eager to forget it. When peace was signed in 1929, Rome began the process of canonizing martyrs, choosing those who had died in clear, orthodox faith. But what of the others? What of the priests who blurred traditions, who wrote with ash, who spoke in strange tongues? Their names were quietly erased. Their stories disappeared from official records. The Church that celebrates relics of saints had no place for relics made of human ash. The Cristero War revealed the best and the worst of faith under fire. It produced martyrs of incredible devotion, but it also spawned practices that hovered on the edge of heresy. The story of the Ash manuscripts belongs to this shadowy zone, where desperation, devotion, and darkness intermingle. And it is precisely in those shadows that we find the origins of one of Mexico's most unsettling legends, priests who dared to take the very dust of death and transform it into scripture. It is in these shadows that the next piece of the puzzle emerges, the manuscripts themselves. What did they look like? What did they say? And why, after almost a century, do they still inspire fear and fascination? The answers lie ahead. The whispers had traveled far, passed from one frightened villager to another, carried across mountain paths and dusty town squares. Somewhere in the hidden heart of Mexico, they said, lay manuscripts unlike any the world had ever seen, pages not written in ink but in the very ashes of the dead. For some, the idea was too grotesque to believe. For others, it was proof of holy defiance, a testament that even when the body was destroyed, faith could still be inscribed upon the world. To explore the legend of these manuscripts is to step directly into the macabre. The first accounts speak of manuscripts hidden in the rural states of Jalisco and Michoacan, the epicenters of the Cristero Rebellion. These were not cities with great libraries or monastic vaults. These were small towns, where a priest might celebrate Mass in a candlelit kitchen or a cavern deep in the Sierra Madre. And yet, it was here that villagers later recalled seeing strange writings. They described thin parchment or crude papers marked with letters that did not gleam like ink, but instead carried a flat, powdery texture, words that seemed almost alive, shifting in the light. To touch them, it was said, was to feel grit under the fingertips, as though the page itself had absorbed the bones of the dead. But what exactly did these manuscripts contain? That is where the mystery deepens. Some claimed they were nothing more than prayers, psalms and liturgies copied for safekeeping, a way to preserve the faith when books were burned and Bibles confiscated. Others insisted they contained records of the war, names of martyrs, accounts of battles, coded messages for Cristero fighters written in a form soldiers would never suspect. Still others believed the writings carried a darker weight, curses against the federal army, invocations of divine wrath, or even apocalyptic prophecies scribbled in desperation. Whatever their true content, the manuscripts were said to pulse with a strange energy, a fusion of the sacred and the profane. Descriptions of their appearance varied. Some villagers spoke of single sheets of parchment, passed hand to hand like relics. Others claimed entire small booklets existed, bound crudely with leather straps or twine. The writing itself was described as uneven, sometimes smeared, as though the ash resisted the page. In some cases, letters appeared in Latin, the universal tongue of the Church, but in others, phrases were interspersed with Spanish or even Nahuatl, remnants of Mexico's indigenous languages. This blend gave the texts an eerie duality, half orthodox scripture, half mystic incantation. One account collected decades later by an anthropologist described a surviving fragment, supposedly kept hidden by a family in rural Michoacan. The page, according to testimony, contained the Lord's Prayer written entirely in what appeared to be a grey, granular substance. At first glance it seemed like faded ink, but when touched, the letters crumbled slightly, leaving a faint smear. The family swore the priest who had written it had mixed the ashes of a martyred Cristero with oil and carefully transcribed the prayer as a way to keep the dead forever tied to the living. Whether the story is true or not, its mere telling has fueled the legend of the manuscripts. Why would priests resort to such a practice? On one level, it was necessity. Ink was scarce, paper dangerous to carry. Ash, however, was everywhere. Fires consumed villages, and the bodies of the executed were often left to burn. What was meant by the government as erasure, reducing rebels to dust, was transformed into defiance. To take ash and use it as writing material was to deny obliteration. It was to say, even if you destroy us, we will write with what remains. But on another level, the act carried symbolic power. In Catholic theology, relics, bones, blood, hair, even clothing of saints, have long been revered as vessels of holiness. To the faithful, the remains of martyrs carried the presence of the divine. In the midst of the Cristero War, when martyrs fell daily, ash itself became a kind of relic. Writing with it was not only practical but profoundly spiritual, a way to fuse prayer with the literal essence of those who had died for Christ. It blurred the line between scripture and relic, creating texts that were alive with both word and body. Of course, not all saw it so charitably. Even among the faithful, there were whispers of unease. Some villagers said the manuscripts had a cursed quality. They spoke of priests who grew pale and haunted after writing them, as if the ashes whispered back. Children were warned not to touch the pages, lest the dead cling to them. To skeptics, the writings looked less like relics and more like sorcery, an occult corruption of the faith. And in truth, to take human remains and use them for writing bore an uncomfortable resemblance to forbidden practices across the world, necromantic grimoires in Europe, bone scripts in Asia, and death rituals of pre-Hispanic Mexico. Whether intentionally or not, these priests seem to have stumbled into territory the Church had long branded as heresy. The fate of these manuscripts is another mystery. Some say they were hidden in caves, buried alongside relics of the Cristeros, never meant to be found. Others claim the government confiscated them during raids, destroying them as evidence of fanaticism. The most chilling theory suggests they were quietly taken by the Church itself, collected, sealed, and locked away in Vatican archives, labeled as classified cult files too dangerous to release. If this is true, then the manuscripts may still exist, gathering dust in a vault beneath Rome, their words unread, their ashes silent but not erased. The manuscripts of Ash raise questions that cut to the core of faith and death. Were they acts of ultimate devotion, sanctifying the dead by turning them into scripture? Or were they desperate experiments, blurring faith and superstition in the fires of war? Were they intended for God's eyes, or for men's? And perhaps most disturbingly, do any of them still exist, hidden somewhere, carrying words not just written about the dead, but written with the dead? As we move deeper into this mystery, we must confront what ash itself meant to those who used it. For in both Catholic tradition and indigenous belief, ash carries layers of meaning: purity, destruction, remembrance, and transformation. To understand why the priests turned to ash, we must look beyond the manuscripts themselves and into the deeper symbolism of ash across cultures. It is there, in the duality of sacred and profane, that the next piece of this macabre puzzle begins to emerge. To truly grasp the unsettling weight of the manuscripts of ash, one must step back and understand what ash has meant across cultures, religions, and histories. Ash is not merely the residue of fire, it is the final form of matter after all shape, color, and texture are stripped away. It is what remains when destruction is absolute. And yet, paradoxically, it is also a symbol of renewal, cleansing, and even immortality. In Catholic tradition, in indigenous rituals, and in global mythologies, ash holds a place both sacred and profane, hovering uneasily between life and death, purity and corruption. It is precisely this duality that makes the manuscripts so charged with meaning. In Catholicism, the most immediate association is Ash Wednesday. Every year, millions of faithful Christians gather in churches to receive a smudge of ash on their foreheads, accompanied by the haunting reminder, "Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return." The ashes, traditionally made by burning palm branches from the previous year's Palm Sunday, are not a mark of despair but of humility and renewal. They symbolize repentance, mortality, and the eternal cycle of death and resurrection. To wear ash is to carry one's own end upon the skin while simultaneously declaring faith in the possibility of salvation. This theology, deeply embedded in Mexican Catholicism, would have resonated strongly with the Cristeros. But ash in Catholic ritual is clean, controlled, and symbolic. The manuscripts described in legend used not palms but human remains. Here lies the transgression. To many priests and villagers, the connection may have seemed natural. If palm ash was holy, why not the ash of martyrs? Did not the saints themselves become holy relics? If so, then perhaps to write prayers in the dust of martyrs was the ultimate form of devotion, a sacred act beyond words. And yet, in the eyes of stricter theologians, this blurred the line into sacrilege, an act that appropriated death in ways that skirted dangerously close to superstition. Beyond Catholicism, ash carried meanings inherited from Mexico's indigenous traditions. In pre-Hispanic rituals, fire and ash were deeply tied to sacrifice and renewal. The Aztecs, for instance, used ashes in purification ceremonies, scattering them upon altars or bodies before sacrifices. Some Nahua rituals involved mixing ashes with maize dough to consume them, symbolizing communion with the divine. Fire was both a destroyer and a purifier, and ash its enduring testimony. For communities whose Catholic faith was layered upon centuries of indigenous ritual, the use of ash would have carried echoes of older traditions. The manuscripts may not have been entirely Catholic inventions, but rather syncretic objects, fusing Christian theology with pre-Columbian symbolism. Globally, the duality of ash appears again and again. In Hindu tradition, ascetics smear themselves with ash to signify renunciation of the world and union with the eternal. In Greek mythology, the phoenix is consumed by fire only to rise again from its ashes, an eternal cycle of death and rebirth. In alchemy, ash represents the nigredo stage, the blackened dissolution from which all transformation begins. Even in modern language, ash carries this paradoxical weight. To rise from the ashes is a triumph of renewal, while to be reduced to ashes is total obliteration. Across these cultural lenses, ash is always more than destruction. It is what lingers after destruction, what both haunts and enables rebirth. The profane side of ash is equally powerful. Ash is what remains after desecration. Cremation in many cultures was historically associated with punishment or dishonor. In medieval Europe, heretics were burned, their ashes scattered as a warning that no relics of their bodies should remain to inspire followers. To write with ash in such a context would be viewed as unholy, even diabolical, an inversion of Scripture. And yet, in a time when the Cristeros themselves were branded heretics and fanatics by the government, perhaps the very act of writing with ash was a way of reclaiming power, turning the stigma of cremation into a badge of defiance. There is also something unsettlingly intimate about ash. Bones and flesh are transformed into powder, indistinguishable and anonymous. To touch it is to touch death stripped of individuality. And yet, to inscribe letters with it is to attempt to restore identity, to give the dead voice and permanence. The manuscripts, if real, were therefore not only texts but also resurrections. Every letter was a defiance of oblivion. Every word carried the weight of both prayer and corpse. For the faithful, this was sanctification. For the skeptical, it was a violation, a profane mingling of Holy Scripture and human remains. The tension between sacred and profane in the use of ash mirrors the larger tension of the Cristero War itself. The rebels framed their struggle as a holy crusade, blessed by God and waged for Christ the King. The government denounced them as criminals, fanatics, and necromancers clinging to medieval superstitions. The manuscripts of ash, if they existed, would have embodied this conflict perfectly. Sacred texts to the faithful, blasphemous abominations to their enemies. Even today, the idea provokes discomfort. Some modern theologians argue that if the manuscripts existed, they would represent a dangerous confusion of relic veneration and necromantic practice. To sanctify ash in this way would be to weaponize death itself, turning remains into instruments of power. Others suggest the manuscripts, real or imagined, are simply folk Catholicism at its most extreme, an example of how rural faith communities adapted ritual to their circumstances, drawing on whatever materials they had to keep belief alive. In either case, the manuscripts blur the clean lines between theology and desperation, doctrine and survival. Ash's dual symbolism, sacred and ritual, profane in its raw reality, also explains why the manuscripts provoke such fascination. They embody the paradox at the heart of human existence, that from destruction can come meaning, that from dust can come words, that even in death, a voice can remain. Whether viewed as relics or as heresies, the manuscripts remind us that ash is never just residue. It is memory, it is defiance, it is the thin line between forgetting and remembrance. As we leave behind the broader symbolism of ash, the story of the manuscripts draws us closer to the question of survival. If such writings did exist, could any have withstood the decades? Could fragile ash letters endure the wear of time, humidity, or human handling? And more importantly, could fragments of them still linger today, in archives, in attics, in hidden shrines? The next chapter in this macabre journey turns to the search for evidence, the scattered traces and testimonies that hint at whether the manuscripts of ash are legend or reality. The most unsettling part of the story is not simply the legend itself, but the gnawing question: did the manuscripts ever truly exist? For years, whispers about their presence circulated among villagers, clergy, and soldiers who claimed to have glimpsed fragments. But legends live in shadows, and the task of uncovering physical evidence is a difficult one. When it comes to fragile artifacts supposedly written in human ash, the challenge borders on impossible. Still, scattered accounts, rumors, and tantalizing hints continue to resurface, tempting historians and investigators to believe that somewhere, tucked away in a forgotten archive or hidden shrine, the manuscripts may yet endure. The first place researchers often turn to is oral testimony. In rural Mexico during the late 1920s and 1930s, literacy was far from universal, and stories were passed more through word of mouth than written record. Old villagers, when asked decades later, recalled tales of priests who carried small, brittle pages in leather pouches, swearing they were sacred relics created from the ashes of martyrs. Some spoke of entire families guarding scraps as if they were holy icons, refusing to let outsiders see them, fearful that government agents or even the church hierarchy itself would confiscate and destroy them. These oral testimonies, while haunting, are difficult to verify. Memories fade, exaggerations grow, and superstition often merges with truth until the two are inseparable. There are also reports of confiscations by government troops during raids on suspected Cristero sympathizers. In certain military logs, vague references appear to heretical documents or unorthodox relics seized in villages. The documents themselves were never catalogued with precision, and most were burned or destroyed in the effort to stamp out religious rebellion. Could some of these heretical texts have been the manuscripts of ash? The records do not say, and the language is deliberately vague, likely because the soldiers themselves were not trained to recognize what they were looking at. To them, the texts may have appeared as nothing more than charred or smudged papers, unworthy of detailed description. Another intriguing trail lies in the archives of the Catholic Church itself. Though the Vatican has remained silent on the matter, Mexican diocesan records from the post-Cristero period contain veiled references to irregular relic practices that required correction. The Church, careful to preserve unity and doctrinal purity, would have had strong motivation to suppress any documentation of priests engaging in unorthodox rituals involving human remains. If manuscripts of ash did exist, they would have been seen as both theologically dangerous and politically explosive. Any records could have been deliberately locked away, misfiled, or destroyed to prevent scandal. Historians who have tried to dig through church records often encounter missing files, unexplained gaps, and frustrating denials. Whether this is due to deliberate suppression or simple archival decay remains unclear. Then there are the physical rumors, claims of fragments still hidden in plain sight. In the 1960s, an anthropologist researching indigenous Catholic practices in Jalisco reported being shown what she described as powdery inscriptions on parchment-like material. The object was brought out briefly by an elderly woman, then quickly taken back, with the explanation that it was a family relic that could not be handled by outsiders. The anthropologist could not verify the material or photograph it, and when she returned years later, the family denied any knowledge of such an object. This kind of anecdote fuels speculation but offers little concrete proof. The challenge, of course, is the fragility of ash itself. If the manuscripts were truly composed by mixing ash with oil or water to create an ink-like substance, the writings could have endured for some time, though still vulnerable to smudging, humidity, or light. But if the letters were formed purely by pressing ash into surfaces, they would have been almost impossible to preserve. Paper would crumble, and any touch could erase them. This makes the possibility of survival slim, but not impossible. Some relics from even more fragile materials have endured when carefully hidden in dry, dark environments. Modern science could, in theory, resolve some of these mysteries. Forensic analysis could determine whether markings on a suspected fragment were made from carbonized human remains or simple plant ash. But to test such a relic would require it being brought into the open, and so far, no family, no parish, no collector has dared or agreed. Fear of desecrating the memory of martyrs, combined with fear of ridicule or even punishment from the church, has kept potential evidence sealed away. There are also darker possibilities. Some historians suggest the manuscripts were nothing more than rumors, created by villagers as a form of psychological resistance. In this theory, the story of priests writing with martyrs' ash was itself a weapon, a tale designed to terrify soldiers and inspire the faithful. By spreading the belief that the dead literally spoke through ash, communities could bolster morale without needing any actual artifact. The manuscripts, in this view, were never physical objects at all, but legends serving as spiritual ammunition. Yet dismissing the manuscripts entirely as myth feels unsatisfying, especially when too many scattered hints continue to appear. The consistency of descriptions, the use of ash, the writing of prayers, the secrecy of the texts, suggests at least some kernel of truth. Perhaps there were only a handful of such pages ever made, quickly destroyed, or hidden. Perhaps the manuscripts were ritual objects intended not to last but to serve as temporary conduits of faith in desperate times. Their disappearance would not make them less real. It would only underline their fragile and forbidden nature. The search for evidence, then, remains ongoing but elusive. Ash itself resists permanence, and the secrecy surrounding the manuscripts ensures that even if they exist, they will not easily be revealed. What remains are the traces, archival gaps, oral whispers, and the uneasy silence of the church. And sometimes, absence itself becomes evidence. For why would so many layers of silence exist if there were nothing to hide? From here, the story leads us deeper into speculation and interpretation. If the manuscripts were real, what were they meant to achieve? Were they acts of faith, works of heresy, or weapons of psychological resistance? And if they were mere legend, what does that say about the human need to turn ashes into words, to find meaning in the dust of tragedy? To answer these questions, we must move beyond evidence into interpretation, examining how belief, secrecy, and survival intertwine in the shadow of war. If the manuscripts of ash existed, then secrecy was their lifeblood. They were not objects meant to be paraded in daylight, nor relics destined for public veneration in gilded reliquaries. Instead, they thrived in the whispers between villages, in the guarded rooms of parish houses, and in the fleeting testimonies passed from one generation to the next. Their survival, whether as fragile artifacts or enduring myths, depended less on paper and ash, and more on the spoken word, the secrecy of faith communities, and the resilience of oral tradition in a time of persecution. During the Cristero War, secrecy was not merely a choice but a necessity. Villagers sympathetic to the rebellion risked brutal retaliation if caught sheltering priests or protecting sacred items. Entire towns were razed, families executed, and churches converted into government outposts. Under such conditions, written evidence was dangerous. A discovered diary, a hidden relic, or a suspicious manuscript could spell death for those who possessed it. Oral tradition, therefore, became the safest vessel for memory. It carried stories without leaving incriminating traces, preserving belief in ways that could survive even the most thorough searches. The manuscripts fit perfectly into this culture of hidden devotion. If a priest or community created them, they would have been shared only with trusted believers, often in the hushed secrecy of candlelit rooms or nighttime gatherings in caves and barns. Villagers might have been permitted to glimpse a page briefly before it was hidden again. The power of the manuscripts was less in their material permanence and more in the ritual surrounding them. To hear that a prayer was written in the ash of martyrs, even without ever seeing it, was enough to reinforce faith and instill awe. Secrecy amplified their mystique, transforming them into half-visible talismans of rebellion. Oral tradition also shaped how these manuscripts were remembered. Stories of their existence varied in detail but remained remarkably consistent in essence. Priests writing psalms in ash, families hiding scraps as relics, soldiers confiscating unholy documents. Such images echoed across regions, passed on from one storyteller to another. Oral traditions often serve as cultural glue, ensuring that even if objects vanish, the meaning they carried endures. Just as ancient myths survive long after their ritual origins are forgotten, the manuscript story persisted even when no physical fragment could be produced. The nature of oral tradition, however, also complicates historical investigation. Every retelling is both preservation and transformation. Details shift according to the teller's memory, the listener's expectations, and the community's needs. A child who overhears an elder describing the manuscripts may, decades later, recount the tale with embellishments, weaving imagination into fact. Over time, the manuscripts become less an object of history and more a symbol of identity. For the Cristero descendants, they are not simply relics of ash, they are proof that their ancestors' faith transcended persecution, that belief was written into the very dust of martyrdom. Secrecy also explains the enduring silence surrounding the manuscripts. Many who may have known more chose not to speak openly. Survivors of the Cristero War lived through an era where revealing such stories could invite ridicule, scandal, or even renewed persecution. Families who allegedly preserved fragments might have passed them down only to the most trusted heirs, wrapped in layers of caution and taboo. In many cases, secrecy itself became sacred. The act of not revealing the manuscripts was seen as part of their power. A relic kept hidden was a relic kept pure. There is also a psychological dimension to secrecy in times of oppression. When a community is denied its public rituals, secrecy allows those rituals to survive underground, taking on new intensity precisely because they are forbidden. The manuscripts of ash, if they existed, were not meant for open display but for private reinforcement of faith. Their power grew from their hiddenness, much like catacomb worship among early Christians or secret Torah readings under regimes that banned Judaism. To possess such manuscripts, even in whispered rumor, was to feel that God still spoke in the darkest of times. But secrecy has another side. It blurs the line between fact and myth. When something cannot be openly verified, its reality becomes subjective, dependent on trust in the teller rather than tangible evidence. This makes the manuscripts especially elusive. Are they remembered because they truly existed, or because secrecy itself made them impossible to disprove? A story told in whispers acquires its own kind of authority, precisely because no one outside the circle can challenge it. In Mexico, secrecy and oral tradition often went hand in hand, especially in communities where Catholic rituals had long been blended with indigenous practices. Oral storytelling preserved not only biblical narratives but also local legends, miracles, and tales of the saints. The manuscripts fit naturally into this environment, becoming another thread in the tapestry of faith stories that gave meaning to suffering. For the villagers, it may not have mattered whether every detail was literally true. What mattered was that the story carried power, that it affirmed resilience, and that it gave shape to the memory of sacrifice. Today, oral tradition remains the primary source for the manuscript story. Elderly descendants of Cristero fighters continue to recount how their grandparents spoke of ash letters carried by priests. Some families claim that something was hidden long ago, though when pressed for specifics, details evaporate into silence. This blend of testimony and secrecy sustains the mystery, ensuring the manuscripts live on as more than a historical curiosity. They become a cultural echo, a reminder of the blurred line between survival and legend. The role of secrecy and oral tradition ultimately tells us something profound about human resilience. When material artifacts cannot survive, stories take their place. When ash crumbles, memory solidifies. The manuscripts may or may not have endured physically, but through whispers and tales, they continue to exist in another form, one that cannot be confiscated, burned, or erased. From here, the narrative takes us beyond secrecy into interpretation. If the manuscripts were hidden, remembered, and retold, what purpose did they serve for the communities who spoke of them? Were they meant as sacred devotion, a form of heresy, or a weapon of resistance? To answer this, we must examine not just what they were, but what they meant. The next section delves into how the manuscripts may have functioned as psychological weapons and instruments of defiance in a war fought as much in spirit as on the battlefield. When we step back from the fragile rumors of ash-bound pages and look at the broader context, a deeper question emerges. What exactly were these manuscripts meant to be? Were they acts of holy devotion, misguided heresy, or deliberate psychological tools forged in the crucible of war? The answer is not simple, because the manuscripts of ash seem to exist at the crossroads of all three. They reveal how faith under pressure can mutate into something both transcendent and unsettling, how the boundaries of orthodoxy bend when survival is at stake, and how even myth itself can become a weapon. To the faithful, the most natural interpretation is that the manuscripts were expressions of devotion. For priests and villagers facing persecution, writing prayers in the ashes of martyrs could be understood as an ultimate act of sanctity. Just as the relics of saints, bones, blood, clothing, were venerated in Catholic tradition, so too could the dust of the dead be seen as holy matter. If palms burned on Ash Wednesday could remind the faithful of mortality, why not the ash of the faithful themselves, who had died for Christ the King? In this interpretation, the manuscripts were not desecration but exaltation. Every word written in ash was a hymn of sacrifice, every page a shrine. For believers, the manuscripts transformed horror into holiness, giving form to the unthinkable loss of loved ones by binding their remains into eternal prayer. Yet to others, even among Catholics, this act would have crossed into dangerous territory. The Church has long maintained strict rules about relics and sacraments, wary of practices that blur the line between piety and superstition. To inscribe scripture with the dust of human remains risked being seen as necromancy, or at least an unholy mingling of death with divine word. In theological terms, it bordered on heresy, an invention not sanctioned by doctrine, one that could scandalize the faithful and invite accusations of idolatry. If priests truly engaged in such practices, they risk censure not only from the government but from their own bishops and superiors. Indeed, the Church's later silence on the matter may be explained by this very danger. The manuscripts were too close to heresy to be defended, and too sacred to the laity to be condemned outright. Beyond devotion or heresy, there lies another possibility. The manuscripts were meant as weapons, not physical ones, but psychological tools in a war of faith. Consider the conditions of the Cristero War. Villagers armed with little more than farming tools faced a government backed by rifles, machine guns, and foreign advisors. In such a lopsided conflict, morale mattered as much as material. Stories of miraculous relics, prayers inscribed in the dust of martyrs, or words written in the remains of the faithful could inspire hope where none should exist. If soldiers believed the dead themselves spoke through ash, they might fight with a courage untouchable by bullets. If villagers believed the manuscripts carried divine protection, they might endure famine and fear with renewed strength. The manuscripts, in this sense, functioned as a kind of sacred propaganda. They did not need to exist in large numbers to have power. A single whispered rumor of their creation could ripple through entire regions, lifting spirits and terrifying enemies. For the government soldiers, hearing that Cristeros were writing prayers in human ash would have confirmed suspicions that they faced fanatics who could not be broken by death. For the Cristeros themselves, it was proof that martyrdom was not the end but the beginning of a holy legacy. Belief in such manuscripts could turn ashes, symbols of loss, into symbols of defiance. History offers many parallels. In times of persecution, persecuted groups often develop secret symbols, relics, or legends to sustain them. Early Christians told stories of martyrs' bones glowing with miracles, even when no such bones were ever found. Jewish communities in medieval Europe clung to tales of hidden Torah scrolls surviving pogroms, fueling resilience despite destruction. The manuscripts of ash fit this pattern. Whether literally real or not, they became psychologically real, serving as invisible weapons in a war fought as much in the spirit as on the battlefield. But this duality, holy relic to some, heresy to others, weapon to all, makes the manuscripts especially disturbing. They force us to confront the way faith and desperation can merge, producing acts that both inspire and unsettle. To write prayers in ash is both profoundly human and profoundly transgressive. It is human because it springs from grief, longing, and the refusal to let the dead be forgotten. It is transgressive because it rewrites the boundaries of what is sacred, dragging the remains of the dead into the act of worship in ways that defy both theology and reason. For this reason, the manuscripts continue to haunt historical imagination. They are neither easily dismissed nor easily defended. To believers, denying them risks dismissing the depth of faith that kept the Christeros alive. To skeptics, accepting them risks endorsing practices that verge on blasphemy. And in the middle lies the unsettling possibility that their true power was never about doctrine or materiality, but about psychology, the way humans weaponize symbols when all else is lost. Even today, their legacy provokes uneasy reactions. Some descendants of Cristero fighters revere the manuscripts as holy memory, refusing to hear them called heretical. Others recoil at the thought, fearing they represent a dangerous extremism that should not be romanticized. Historians, caught between oral testimony and the absence of physical evidence, struggle to categorize them: relic, myth, or psychological tool. Perhaps they were all three, depending on who held them, who heard of them, and who feared them. This ambiguity is what keeps the manuscripts alive in cultural memory. They were never simply texts. They were mirrors, reflecting the faith, fear, and fury of a people under siege. To call them holy is true. To call them heretical is true. To call them weapons is also true. And in that uneasy triad lies their lasting mystery. The next step in this exploration brings us to the question of survival and legacy. Even if the manuscripts themselves have crumbled into dust, their story lingers. How did their legend shape the identity of the communities that remembered them? And what role do they play in Mexico's broader cultural memory today, nearly a century later? That is where we turn next. If the manuscripts of ash ever truly existed, their physical forms are almost certainly gone. Ash is fragile, its particles light enough to scatter with a breath, its markings too delicate to resist time, humidity, or human touch. Paper disintegrates. Ink fades. And yet, in an ironic twist, the manuscripts may have achieved a kind of immortality that physical objects rarely do. They survived in memory, in story, in legend. Their legacy is not written in archives but in the hearts and voices of those who carried the Cristero struggle into the present. Survival takes many forms, and in Mexico, the survival of the Cristero War itself is a contested memory. Official history, for decades, minimized or erased the conflict, painting it as fanaticism rather than resistance. Government textbooks skipped over the rebellion, framing it as an embarrassment in the march toward modern secularism. But among the rural families who fought, who lost sons and fathers, who buried their dead in secret, the war lived on in songs, prayers, and whispered tales. The manuscripts of ash, real or imagined, became part of this underground memory culture. They were tokens of defiance, reminders that even if the state tried to silence faith, the faithful had written their prayers in the very dust of their martyrs. In communities that claimed to have preserved fragments, the manuscripts became family relics, wrapped in layers of secrecy. A page rumored to be hidden in an attic, a scrap mentioned by a grandmother on her deathbed. These stories persisted, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with unease. Whether the fragments themselves survived is almost beside the point. What mattered was the belief that they had once existed, that somewhere in the lineage of faith lay tangible proof of devotion written in ash. For the descendants of the Cristeros, this belief provided continuity with their ancestors' struggle, a thread linking past sacrifice to present identity. The legacy of the manuscripts also resonates in Mexican Catholicism more broadly. Rural shrines, holy cards, and local devotions often carry traces of themes central to the manuscripts: martyrdom, sacrifice, the sanctification of suffering. In the retelling of the Cristero War during later decades, the idea of relics born from martyrs' remains became symbolic of the Church's endurance under fire. Even if priests and bishops never formally acknowledged the manuscripts, the faithful folded them into the broader narrative of resistance, the Church that survives not in cathedrals but in ashes, not in printed books but in whispered prayers. Cultural survival also comes through music and oral storytelling. Cristero corridos, folk ballads about the war, celebrate martyrs, miracles, and relics. Some versions allude obliquely to the words written in dust, a line that scholars argue may reference the manuscripts. These corridos, sung at family gatherings or remembered in fragments, kept the legend alive across generations. Oral tradition, with its ability to preserve even the faintest whispers, ensured that the manuscripts did not vanish entirely, even if their physical pages did. The psychological legacy is perhaps the most profound. The manuscripts symbolize the capacity of human beings to resist erasure. They embody the determination to give meaning to death, to transform loss into language. For a people facing the annihilation of their religious identity, the manuscripts stood as proof that nothing, not even fire, not even ash, could silence their faith. This message outlived the manuscripts themselves, carrying forward into how communities remembered and interpreted their struggle. At the same time, the manuscripts' legacy is controversial. To some, they represent dangerous superstition, a step too close to heresy or fanaticism. Scholars and skeptics argue that celebrating them risks romanticizing a dark practice, blurring the lines between faith and extremism. For these critics, the manuscripts are cautionary tales, evidence of how desperation can warp devotion into something troubling. The legacy, in this sense, is a double-edged sword, both a source of pride for some and of discomfort for others. Yet this tension only deepens their importance. True relics are always controversial. They provoke debate, skepticism, reverence, and awe. The manuscripts, whether real or mythic, function in exactly this way. They force communities to wrestle with the boundaries of belief, with the uneasy proximity between holiness and horror. They endure because they ask unsettling questions about what humans are willing to sanctify when pushed to the edge of survival. Today, nearly a century after the Cristero War, the manuscript's survival lies less in hidden fragments and more in the way they have become cultural echoes. They appear in academic debates, in hushed stories passed down in villages, in the quiet insistence of descendants that something once existed, even if the world refuses to see it. They survive in silence, in absence, in the spaces where history and myth overlap. The legacy of the manuscripts is therefore not about ash, ink, or parchment. It is about memory's ability to outlast destruction. It is about how humans cling to symbols when everything else is stripped away. The manuscripts remind us that survival is not always physical. Sometimes it is narrative, sometimes it is psychological, sometimes it is simply the refusal to forget. As we approach the end of this story, one final question remains. What do the manuscripts mean for us today? Beyond their historical context, beyond their theological controversy, what lessons do they offer about the human condition, about the thin line between faith and fanaticism, and about the enduring need to find meaning in ashes? That is where we must turn next. The story of the priests who wrote in human ash, whether grounded in fact or born from the fertile soil of legend, lingers in the mind like smoke that refuses to clear. It is a tale that straddles the boundaries of faith and fanaticism, history and myth, horror and reverence. At its heart lies one of humanity's most enduring questions. How do we preserve meaning when everything around us is reduced to dust? In the Mexico of 1928, the Cristero War had stripped life to its rawest form. Families buried their dead in secret. Villages lived under constant threat of soldiers. Faith, once expressed openly in churches, processions, and sacraments, was driven underground. In such a world, the act of writing in ash was more than ritual, it was defiance. It declared that even in destruction, something sacred could be born. It was a refusal to let silence or erasure triumph. But what makes this story resonate nearly a century later is not only its historical strangeness. It is the way it mirrors our own struggles to find meaning in loss. Every generation, every culture, grapples with the ashes of its past, whether literal ashes from fire, war, or disaster, or metaphorical ashes of dreams and lives undone. To write in ash is, in some sense, what humanity has always done. We turn ruin into story. We shape absence into presence. We refuse to let destruction have the last word. Yet the tale also carries a warning. There is a fine line between sanctity and obsession, between honoring the dead and exploiting them. To write with human remains is both a profound act of remembrance and a deeply unsettling violation. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Can desperation justify breaking taboos? Can grief excuse practices that might otherwise seem abhorrent? At what point does devotion blur into fanaticism? These are not questions confined to 1928 Mexico. They remain alive in every culture where trauma and faith collide. For the Catholic Church, the manuscripts of ash, if they truly existed, represent both a challenge and an opportunity. They challenge official doctrine, which has always been cautious about relics and wary of superstition. At the same time, They offer a vivid example of faith's resilience under persecution. To this day, the Church has never formally acknowledged them, perhaps because doing so would mean confronting their disturbing implications. But among the faithful, the manuscript's legacy lives on, not in papal decrees but in quiet stories, songs, and symbols. The manuscripts also echo beyond religion. To historians, they are a reminder that official archives tell only part of the story. The rest survives in fragments, rumors, and contested memories. To psychologists, they reveal the extraordinary ways humans cope with trauma, turning even ashes into vessels of meaning. To artists and storytellers, they provide a haunting metaphor for creativity born from suffering. And to those who simply listen to the tale, they offer a chilling but strangely hopeful truth, that even in devastation, people find ways to write themselves back into history. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the manuscripts is that survival is not only physical. Even when bodies are burned, even when paper decays, even when memory falters, symbols endure. The manuscripts remind us that human beings will always seek to leave a mark, however fragile, however strange. We are creatures who cannot accept silence. We must write, sing, carve, paint, or whisper, because in these acts, we assert that our lives meant something, that our suffering was not in vain. As the Cristero priests faced fire and death, they chose ash as their medium. It was temporary, ephemeral, destined to scatter. And yet, by writing with it, they ensured that their struggle would be remembered, if not in libraries, then in the collective imagination of a people. The manuscripts may never be found, their pages may have turned to dust long ago, but their story endures. And sometimes, story is more enduring than stone. In the end, the priests who wrote in human ash remind us of the duality of faith, its power to console and its power to unsettle, its ability to preserve meaning even as it risks descending into obsession. They remind us that history is not only about battles and treaties but about symbols forged in moments of desperation. And above all, they remind us that in the ashes of ruin, humanity always looks for a way to write itself anew. The question is not whether the manuscripts still exist. The question is what they tell us about ourselves, about the need to remember, about the hunger for meaning, about the strange, fragile ways we resist being forgotten. And so, the story closes not with certainty but with a haunting image. A dimly lit room in 1928 Mexico, a priest hunched over a piece of parchment, his fingers trembling as he dips into ash. Each word he writes is fragile, each letter doomed to fade. But still, he writes. Because in writing, he declares that even in death, there is something that endures. Something that cannot be silenced. Something that refuses to vanish into the dust.